Hey guys, lecture we're going to talk about how species originate in a term called speciation. So how do new species form? Um, so when we look back at Darwin, this is kind of the answer or the question that Darwin never really answered in his work was how do new species arise? He couldn't necessarily figure it out. But later on we kind of saw how it happened. So first of all, what exactly is a species? What defines something as a species? So, important term to know. It's called the biological species concept, aka what a species is. A species is a population whose members can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So it's important. So not only can you breed, not only can you make offspring, but those offspring also should be fertile and can also reproduce. And you see instances of this where that does not happen, and we'll talk about that. So they basically have to be reproductively compatible. So you see two different species, eastern meadowlark, western meadowlark, look very, very similar. They cannot reproduce. Whereas many different species or many different races of human can, of course, reproduce. So that's kind of, again, that's what science believes defines a species as. Someone who can interbreed, produce viable and fertile offspring. So basically, when we look at how new species formed, scientists found a kind of common theme. And that theme is that population became isolated somehow. And we'll look at the different types of isolations that exist. But basically, this group of individuals became isolated from everyone else for some reason. And a lot of times is geographically isolated. Sometimes is reproductively isolated. But in any case, they were isolated and therefore evolved independently of each other. Eventually, they could not, or they do not, reproduce together. Therefore, eventually they separated, became two new species. So that's why we see a lot of similar species, but are still considered different. So these are the pre-reproduction barriers. So before reproduction even happens, these are the ones we're going to focus on. Exactly what isolation mechanisms exist that will separate these species from reproducing. So geographical isolation, and this could be many different things. It could be a canyon, it could be a mountain range, it could be a giant lake, it could be anything, really, anything it's a geographic object that makes it hard or difficult for those species to interbreed. So again, if you're separated by this mountain range for some reason, you're going to eventually become a new species. Ecological isolation, this deals with where exactly your habitat is and exactly how it interacts with other different species. So we'll look more into that. Temporal isolation is usually temporal meaning timing. That deals with like seasons. Some species will only reproduce or only breed in spring, whereas the other species breeds during the fall. So therefore, there's never going to be a time where they breed at the same time. Next one is behavioral isolation. This is, again, some type of behavior signals for breeding, and we're going to look at that. Birds do this all the time. Another type is mechanical isolation. In so many words, doesn't fit. They try to breed, for whatever reason, it doesn't work mechanically. Like actual things don't fit. And so those are the different pre-reproduction barriers, which are the ones we're going to focus on. So geographic isolation, species occur in different areas. So there is some physical barrier separating the two species. They're isolated from each other. They become new species. Pretty simple as that. Ecological isolation. So species occur in the same region but occupy different habitats, so they rarely interact with each other. So with lions and tigers, very similar, but one's in the valleys, the other one's in the jungle. So because they're in different habitats, therefore they're reproductively isolated. They can't reproduce. They don't crossbreed. And eventually, at that millions of years ago, they became a new species and has become more separated ever since. So garter snakes live in the same area, but one lives in water, one is terrestrial, meaning lives on land, and boom, like they're separated in that way. And if you're isolated from each other, you eventually become new species. And again, this process takes thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years to occur. So don't get in your head that if you isolate yourself from humans, that you will become a new species, because that doesn't work. Again, this takes thousands of years and many, many individuals for this to occur. And like I said before, in movies or in just pop culture, you've heard of the liger or the tigon, which is the cross between a lion and tiger, and that does exist. That does happen. But again, going back to the species concept, that liger or tigon doesn't or cannot reproduce. It can't make any babies. It is infertile. It is sterile. So that's kind of the difference. They can actually make a liger or a tigon, but that baby is not going to be able to reproduce at all. Temporal isolation. So temporal isolation is species that breed during different times of day, different seasons, different years, and therefore cannot mix their gametes. Again, this is an example of reproductive isolation. Pretty simple. They don't breed at the same time, same place. Or I should say same time, and therefore they never overlap. Behavioral isolation, unique behaviors and rituals that isolate species. So again, that particular species, it's like the blue-footed boobies, like they're expected to have that particular characteristic, this particular dance. If they don't have these characteristics or this dance, then they can't reproduce. So again, they're isolating themselves through this behavioral interaction. Mechanical isolation, again, morphological differences, physical differences can prevent successful mating. This is an example of reproductive isolation. So in this case, even in closely related species of plants, the flowers have very distinct appearances that attract different pollinators. And this will make it impossible for them to interbreed. Mechanical isolation, again, lost train of thought. So the mechanical isolation, more examples of this. Again, the female or male sex organs of closely related species don't fit together. Therefore, there's no sperm transfer. Therefore, there's no breeding that exists. So again, isolation that's the key here. Isolation from each other. Different ways you can become isolated. And so this basically, I wanted to present this idea to you. I'm not going to go into post hybridization or post fertilization isolations, but basically I wanted to present this to you because I know this would be interesting to you guys, is the idea of these species crossing together and they can't produce a baby, but that baby is infertile. So you see this a lot. I've already mentioned the tigon and the liger. Horses and donkeys can make mules, and mules are great workers, but they're sterile. They won't be able to have any babies. So you see this all the time in lots of different instances of closely related species. They can reproduce, but they can't produce fertile offspring. And that's it, guys. So pretty short. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a great night.